Anyway, and let me talk about those grazing fees and how that system all worked. The grazing fee was based on an AUM, which stands for Animal Unit Monthly. Okay, and so for every animal you had out there, you would pay a certain amount in those grazing fees, and of that amount, the Bureau of Land Management only kept 12.5% of it for their management fee. Okay, so I know that that amount, that AUM price, has changed over the years, but for argument's sake or for discussion's sake, let's just say it was $1. Of that dollar, the Bureau of Land Management only receives 12.5% of it. The other 87.5% went to a grazing advisory board in Nevada. That's called the N5, or at least in this area it's called the N5. And the grazing advisory board, again, their purpose was to improve rangeland. And my father actually was a member and sat on the board of the Grazing Advisory Board. Now, the Grazing Advisory Board, they would collect all this money from the various ranchers that participated. And then when a rancher needed an improvement on his range, say a new fence or a new water line or a new water trough or something of the sort, then the rancher would petition the Grazing Board for some funds to help fund that new improvement. And then the Grazing Board would decide, which rancher received the money, and maybe we couldn't do our project this year, maybe we could do it next year because somebody else got the money this year. And so again, 87.5% of that money came back to the ranch. So again, the only amount that really went to the BLM was that 12.5%. And I want to reiterate and strongly bring this case to be, is that the grazing fee never paid for feed. It never paid for the right to graze. That right already existed. It never paid for the privilege, for a license, for a lease. Okay, all of these terms have come up later in time. The Bureau of Land Management now wants everyone to believe, and they've about got most ranchers and other people buffaloed into believing, that they own the land and that rights do not exist, and that the only reason a rancher is able to graze is because they give them permission to, that they're leasing their land to the rancher. None of this is true. None of this is true. The rights already existed. The rancher owns those rights. They're a completely separate thing from the Bureau of Land Management. The rights are separate from the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay, so at what point did this relationship, because that sounds like, I can see why every rancher would sign up for that, because a project that would take me 10 years to save up for, if everybody pulled in together, I could do my project this year, you could do your project next year. It seemed, I can see why ranchers would go for that.
And
So
what do we call
point
that? What do we call that? We call that socialism, don't we?
Yeah, that could be, or could, Chinese do it now. I mean, they have why we call it a hui. We get together, we decide who's going to, benefit. But it's done amongst the people that are benefiting from it, not a.
Well, and if perhaps we left the government out of the deal,
Yeah.
and just a co-op of ranchers get together, it
Right.
might work.
Yeah.
But as soon as you bring in a government entity, then they, as the BLM have done, eventually claim that they own, claim that they have control, claim that they have authority, which they never had.
Okay. So at what point did you become aware of this, that your dad was disenchanted with the way the BLM was managing the situation and spending that money?
Well, things started to get worse after 1976. That was when the new CLEPI regulations come out. Bureau of Land Management started to grow. They started to use those grazing fees, the money that was supposed to come back to the ranchers in a range of improvements, started to be used for wildlife reasons rather than ranching reasons. They started to be used for environmental reasons rather than for ranching purposes. In other words, everything started to get convoluted in its original purpose and original intent. The Bureau of Land Management became, again, back when the Bureau of Land Management was first in existence, and in those early years, we had numerous ranchers in the area, and they had about 2 or 3 BLM guys in a small little office in Vegas.
How many ranches?
Well, in Clark County alone, there were 53 ranchers. Okay, they had probably 53 ranchers and maybe 3 BLM guys. All right, and now it's just the opposite of that, but there's probably 500 BLM guys. You know, I don't know the true number, and that might be an exaggeration, but you get my point. And there's only 1 rancher left. Okay, so you can see how all of this has got convoluted. And again, back to my story about the BLM, the BLM became infiltrated with environmentalists. They began, instead of performing their original task to strengthen the range rights, the ranchers' rights, they began to tear them down because other people with other interests came into control. And so now the environmentalist lobby wanted the cattle gone, and they at this time were starting to claim authority rather than just a service. And so they began to purposely manage the ranchers out of business. They began to manage the ranchers out of business, and they continue to do that today.